At any rate, let's go ahead and transition into this. I guess
Hmm.
before we get into the winners and the categories and all that, what did you think about the ceremony on the whole? Jimmy Kimmel, structure, flow. How did it all feel for you?
This is such a loaded question, I feel like, because I almost think I can argue both sides of whether it was a good ceremony or not. And the reason why is really just in the trajectory of how we felt about the ceremonies over the past few years. And we've been no stranger to saying this, JD, but maybe the past two ceremonies at least have been kind of chaos.
Hmm.
Like there were choices that were made, some securities that were not made. I'll simply say, given last year,
Sure.
there was a lot
Yeah.
of swings being made.
Uh
Um,
huh.
so so that was happening, and then the whole debacle. I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. Sense of time has gone out the window for me lately. But the whole switching of the order with Best Picture
Yeah.
and
That
putting
was
Best
2 years
Actor.
ago.
That was 2 years ago. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
like
that's it's funny because I thought that's what you were alluding to. There was the literal swing last year, and then two
yeah,
years ago, the metaphorical swing by
yeah.
Soderbergh to go big at the end. So,
Yeah, yeah, to go big or go home, and we all went home. Um,
exactly.
but you think about those two examples. Of course, you trace it back to the 2017 ceremony, I think, when the whole Moonlight La La Land swap accidentally occurred. So
Sure.
I feel like many
Mhm.
people still aren't over that, which is why last night's ceremony was probably a breath of fresh air, given how controlled it felt. It was a very familiar feeling ceremony. And I mean that in sort of a positive way. I almost equate it to how we felt maybe seeing The Force Awakens for the first time, because it was sort of like our re-entry into what we already know and love about Star Wars, which is what I feel like last night was trying to do for the Oscars. It
Mhm.
was a very familiar type of show. You know, we've seen Jimmy Kimmel host I don't even know how many times, but even in the
This
past,
is his third time.
third time in like a short
Yeah.
amount of time. So
Yeah, last
uh,
6 years or so.
and
Yeah.
honestly, I thought he was fine, but I think you kind of needed fine after everything that the
Yeah.
Oscars went through over the past few years. I mean, some of his opening monologue, I couldn't help but think, you know, we're on film Twitter, the whole Nicole Kidman being trapped in an abandoned AM's, like that's like
Yeah.
old jokes for us on film Twitter. We've been making that joke for the past year. If you're on film Twitter, you've seen that before. Although it's funny for those who aren't in that world. The general audiences
Exactly.
can pick up
Yeah.
on something. So it's funny in that regard. I admittedly did get a chuckle when he mentioned about James Cameron and Tom Cruise being the ones that brought us back to the theater,
And
and
then
they're
they
the
didn't
ones who
show up to
didn't
the
make it to
theater.
the theater. So I love the comedic
Yeah.
irony there. So I
Uh-huh.
guess I feel like I could be harder on this ceremony if it weren't for the cluster F of the past couple ceremonies. I would be calling it
Mhm.
too safe. I would be calling it too sterile, like it didn't take any chances. But I think we needed something a little safe and controlled after the chaos that we got.
Mhm.
So, in that regard, I'm glad we've found our footing again as far as the way that the show is paced and structured. Still, a couple things we'll talk about that I didn't like, but
Yeah.
overall, I think it's a step in the right direction, given what came directly before it.
Yeah. So just to get right into it, I absolutely loved the structure and flow of last night. I loved it.
Gotcha.
I think
Okay,
it's one of the
good.
very best Oscar ceremonies we've had in a really long time, partially because we're coming off the heels of the cluster bombs that you mentioned
Yeah,
earlier
yeah.
that we saw last year and the year previously. But even going back the last 6, 7, 8 years, their ceremonies have been often very disjointed. They've been a cluster in their own right in terms of all of these comedic gags and these sideshows that these comedians feel like they have to do. What I loved about last night is that it trimmed off a ton of fat. It was
Hmm.
a very seamless show for the most part. It was way less tacky than usual.
Yeah,
Really,
true.
the TV timeouts were the biggest culprit, and the
Yeah.
self-indulgent marketing by Disney, the Little Mermaid
We'll
trailer.
get
Get
into
that out of
that.
here.
Get the
Don't
Warner
really need
Brothers
that.
thing as well. Get that out of there,
I agree.
especially given that there were at least 3 instances where speeches got rudely interrupted by music, only to make room for exactly these things that we're talking about, and that was really
Mhm.
unfortunate.
I completely agree because once we get through the opening monologue, which I do want to speak to here in a moment,
Hmm.
what it was mostly was the categories. it was
Yeah.
about the nominees themselves, or it was about celebrating cinema, whether it be these montages or various clips from these films. It all came back to celebrating cinema in some way. The only sideshow distraction we had throughout the entire night was when Kimmel went into the crowd to do a short Q&A because they had to redo the stage. That was the only reason.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he was transparent about that, which I also appreciate, because
Yeah.
oftentimes they
I
do these
appreciate that.
side gags that are absolutely erroneous and unnecessary, and they trimmed all of that. Partially because they wanted to include every single one of these categories to be on air this year after the controversy of doing some of them off air.
Right.
So to do that, they trimmed out like all the sideshow distraction nonsense they got rid of, and they only had to do one, and it was, admittedly pretty brief. And the only reason we had the one is because they had to reset the stage.
Yeah.
Understandable.
Yeah,
But
makes
aside
sense.
from that, it was a very seamless show. It had a really nice flow to it. The TV timeouts were the only
long.
thing really getting in the way, because
Too
you
long.
would do a category, a clip, maybe a little thing here and there, and then 16 minutes of commercials.
Yeah,
It's
I
like,
mean,
good God.
I get that's how they have to make their money, but at the same time, this is ABC we're talking about, who's owned by Disney. Do they really need it? So there's a double-edged sword there. But no, you're right. Really, the biggest culprit came down to ad space, and then two instances, as we already alluded to, with Disney trying to take the time to market a new trailer for The Little Mermaid, which honestly just came off as awkward and
It was bad.
unnecessary.
Yeah, that was
And
bad.
and honestly, the trailer is not that great if you ask me, but that's kind of beside the point. Really, the
Yeah.
problem is
That just made it
the
worse.
self-congratulatory thing,
Yeah.
which was very annoying.
And that was clearly out of Kimmel's hands.
Yeah.
In terms of getting us from one element to the next, I thought Kimmel did a really great job. And that's just in terms of structure and flow. The other thing
Yeah.
I loved is that as he would introduce people to the stage or new categories, he would have these small little gags that were, again, brief. It wasn't like a 10-minute sideshow distraction.
Yeah.
It was like a 15-second joke, and then we're moving on to the next thing. And oftentimes, I mean, the jokes themselves I thought were fine to pretty good.
Yeah.
And in the middle of it, he was, for one, he wasn't antagonistic toward any of the movies and nominees. And that's another thing, right? Because you substitute him with something like a Ricky Gervais, and that's all Gervais does. He loves stirring up the pot and getting the hornet's
Yeah.
nest all riled up, which can be great. I don't mind that style or tone. Gervais at the Globes is a really great fit, I think, and he was always very good. But the one thing I do like about the Oscars, and at least with Kimmel last night, is his material wasn't antagonistic. He wasn't trying to point the finger, although he did that a little bit playfully. But it was mostly about honoring and showing reverence and celebration toward these movies. Perhaps part of that is how some of them had saved the theater experience, saved theatrical distribution. Maybe that's where that love is coming from. But he showed an interesting reverence, and not just to the actors, not just to the Best Picture nominees, but the craft categories, which I thought was extremely important, because it's not often that you see that. And as someone, like, I come from a sound engineering background, so I know what it's like to be in that position, to do a lot of that hard work, and it's all behind the scenes. Like, you never get recognized for it.
Yeah,
The Oscars is one of those nights where we do get to recognize these, but oftentimes, even at the Oscars, they kind of brush through them as quickly as they can, because we want to get to Best Actress and we want to get to Best Director and all that sort of stuff. And so the below the line categories have often kind of been, shoved to the wayside a little bit until last night. I thought Kimmel did a very good job of recognizing those categories. So the flow and structure was good.
Yeah.
And also just in terms of the content, it came from a pure place, and I really appreciated that.
Well, it wasn't just Kimmel as well. I'm thinking of an example of when Michael B. Jordan and Jonathan Majors came out to
exactly.
Was that for Best Cinematography? I think.
Yes.
Yeah. There was a
Another
lot of
great-
time dedicated to camera tech, and they even reference not just Spike Lee but also Orson Welles and the way
Yeah.
that they would,
Hmm.
cut a literal hole in the floor to angle a certain shot. Like
Hmm.
little things like that, I really do appreciate, which is
I
probably
agree.
why it's probably why the ceremony felt less, I guess, sporty this time around, if there's any word
It
for it.
felt more celebratory, and that
Yeah,
hasn't always been the case.
yeah, and while I will admit I sometimes like when there's a host that's a bit, I don't wanna say jabby, but maybe a little bit bold in the way that they comedically point the finger at things. Because I kinda like
Yeah.
when when the ceremony does take a few risks and the host is given the
Sure.
opportunity to take
Sure.
some
Sure.
risks.
Sure. Yeah.
At the same time, it raises the question, was last night the right time for that, given the 2 years that led up to it,
Yes.
and the 2 ceremonies specifically that led up to it? And maybe not. So, as a result, the show not only came off as less sporty, but weirdly less political as well, despite the
That
fact that
too. Yep.
it really celebrated diversity with the
Hmm.
film Everything Everywhere All at Once doing so well and honoring said diversity, Asian
Yeah.
diversity specifically.
Hmm.
Um, so it had that. It had a very indirect social message without uh people or presenters or even the host directly commenting on that in an almost antagonistic way, like you said. Sometimes that's
Hmm.
warranted, but there was, like I said, a weird sense of safety with last night that I could easily criticize given some similar award shows or award ceremonies that came maybe 10 years ago or so. But yeah, I think we needed something like that to ease us
Yeah.
back into the love of movies.
I completely agree. And that's why I had a great time last night. I've seen a lot of comments about how the ceremony was bland and dull. And maybe that's the case because you know
Yeah,
what? There was a lot less comedy than usual. And
there
I
was.
think that's a
Yeah.
great thing. I
Yeah.
don't like all of the sideshow nonsense. Get it out of here. Like
Yeah.
we
Now,
don't need it.
yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Now, to be fair, in some cases, with every Oscar ceremony, the comedy can be hit or miss, right? And
That's
there
the
were
other thing.
that's it. Oh,
Yeah.
there were occasions where last night the comedy didn't always work for me. I really struggle with Elizabeth Banks coming out with the literal cocaine bear next to her. That just did not work for me personally.
Fair.
I was really waiting for that to be Matt Damon. Or-
I was kind of I've read that theory and
yeah.
I was hoping that would be the case as
Yeah,
well.
I thought it could have been a missed opportunity right there, but yeah, I mean, it's always hit or miss, but where it does hit, I think it really did work. I mean, I know there's a lot of, I guess, controversy right now regarding Hugh Grant and the interview that he gave leading up to the awards, but him with Andy McDowell was really quite a riot. Some of the stuff that he had
Yeah,
to say, I thought was really funny.
I agree.
There were bits that did work for me.
And all of that was on stage and it was brief. We weren't
Hmm.
doing these elaborate pranks. We weren't leaving the theater and going somewhere else. You know, we weren't pausing and waiting for pizza to come and let's take a giant selfie for a
Yeah.
million likes.
Hmm.
Like it was none of that. A lot of the after the opening monologue, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah.
Again, more reverent than maybe I anticipated. Of course, you were going to get a Will Smith jab in there.
Yeah.
But
But
I
again,
like
it
how
was brief. It was more of a direct not a commentary, but it was more addressing
yeah,
the academy realizing they need to make some
the
changes.
safety, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's what is. So it actually had like a sense of productivity in
yeah.
bringing it up.
And you know, he had to bring it up. He couldn't
You
not
you have to,
say
yeah.
something. But I like how he kind of built to it. It wasn't the first thing, you know, which he could have let off with it, and I think
Right,
everyone would have been, you know, okay with that.
right.
But I do like how he builds up to it. It was a great monologue. It ends really great with the not to gag,
Hmm.
which I thought was great. And then again, everything was pretty seamless, getting us from one transition to the next, in a way that doesn't involve a ton of levity,
Hmm.
uh, less so than a lot of other years. But I'm okay with that because I don't watch the Oscars for stand up comedy.
Right.
That's not what we're there for. We're there
I
to get
agree.
it, and it's already a long show.
Yeah.
So let's just like I've always been a proponent of do the opening monologue, and then after that, the host you can just get rid of them. Like just get us from one thing to the next. You know what I mean? Like I
But
don't
just
need
there
all
for
of this
transition
filler in
purposes,
between.
really. Yeah, yeah, you're
Yeah, I
right.
don't need a ton of filler. And the little filler that Kimmel brought, again, they were 15-second jokes or 15-second gags. that just
Mhm.
got us to the next thing. So I thought the show, the ceremony was seamless, and then it could just be about the nominees and winners.